Joining us now, Michigan State Democratic Party Chair Lavora Barnes, Democratic State Senator of Pennsylvania Marty Flynn, and Charles Coleman, former prosecutor, MSNBC legal analyst, and co-host of the MSNBC special Black Men in America, The Road to 2024. When Barack Obama, Charles, puts his arms akimbo and says, I've got a problem with that, and he's looking at you. Look, you wrote an essay about this for the New York Times. It was headlined, Black men are waiting for a Democratic Party that delivers for them. Yeah. Where do you see the gap in what the campaign is offering and what black men are looking for?
Well, I think one of the things that has to be understood is that you're talking to a very specific segment of this voting demographic. You're talking to primarily black males who are under the age of 50. And when you talk about that, they are looking at the big picture in terms of everything that they are measuring their future by, and they're not necessarily seeing much that's promising. They're seeing themselves still in last place in a number of different indexes, and that's troubling to them. One of the things that I was I have, Chris, a profound amount of respect for our 44th Commander-in-Chief, Barack Obama. However, I don't think that the rhetoric yesterday in terms of how it was framed was helpful to the conversation. There's no other voting bloc that you would talk to in that way and then turn around and expect their support. And I do understand that there's a nuanced language when men talk to men, and I'm very sensitive to that. But I also understand that if people are complaining about apathy and not being seen or heard, to dismiss their complaints as excuses is not a good thing.
So what would you have wanted to hear from him?
He talked about part of what black men were concerned about, or what he was concerned about in terms of the misogyny piece. But what about the other part? What are the part that is legitimate? Could you acknowledge that and talk about what the Harrison-Walz campaign intends to do about whatever element of that you deem legitimate, because that's forward-looking and that's going to get black men motivated, not downing them and telling them why, they're so bad in terms of where they are now or interrogating her candidacy.
So, Lavora, there is new reporting that Democrats in your state are worried about shoring up support among black men. 36 black Detroiters told Politico their concerns include they were lamenting the campaign hasn't reached out enough to well-known grassroots organizations, that messaging targeting black men is not even being prioritized. Does that line up with what you're hearing on the ground? And if so, what do you think needs to change?
I'll start by saying what we hear on the ground, because we are on the ground and have been on the ground for years now as the Michigan Democratic Party. We've got our folks in churches, in barbershops all over Detroit and all over the state, because we need to keep in mind black folks in Michigan live in other places other than Detroit. So we are making sure we're reaching out in Flint and in Pontiac and in Saginaw and Benton Harbor, everywhere black folks are. And, we've reached out to churches that aren't on the top of the list. They aren't always the biggest churches. We know the campaigns go to the big churches, and so the party's been paying a lot of attention to hundreds of smaller churches where we're getting in and having conversations about how you get souls to the polls and how you put feet on the ground and how you get people to participate and vote. And we're doing the same in barber and beauty shops. We're doing the same in nightclubs. We've got folks everywhere finding black folks where they are to have conversations with them about this election, about Kamala Harris, about Donald Trump, and who he is and who he will be if we allow him to be president again. We're all over the place. And what we're hearing from the folks we're talking to is that they appreciate our appearance in their neighborhoods and in their towns and in their communities. And so we're going to keep doing it for the next 25 days. And frankly, because we're the state party and we're here all the time, we're going to keep doing it after this election as well.
But I guess the question is it enough to show up? And I'm not in any way dismissing that. It's important to show up. But it sounds like, from the conversations with a lot of folks, they're not hearing necessarily what they want to hear.
I think that a little bit of it is that people, we talk a lot about how we as Democrats need to fall in love. I think a lot of people are looking for that one sound bite, that one thing that they care about that they haven't yet heard from the campaign. Don't always know what that is for everyone. But we're doing, I think, a good job telling the story of who Kamala Harris and Governor Walz are and who they will be as president and vice president, and how that will impact the lives of black men, black women, and all the people of Michigan in a positive way. And we're going to keep doing that.
Marty, let's talk about Pennsylvania, because at his rally in your state last night, Pittsburgh, Barack Obama also called on men to reject Trump's bombast.
Yeah, I think
when Donald Trump
lies or cheats or shows utter disregard for our Constitution, when he calls POWs losers or fellow citizens vermin. People make excuses for it. They think it's okay. Who seem to think Trump's behavior, the bullying and the putting people down, is a sign of strength. And I am here to tell you that is not what real strength is.
Does that resonate with Pennsylvania voters? I wonder what you're hearing on the ground about the outreach, Marty.
A lot of the time, I think it's basically a culture war that we're faced, and the way the Republican Party continues to put a war on masculinity and what they define as a strong man, and they're gonna come at us with their idea of masculinity and how they perceive the Democratic Party to approach that topic, and that's just not the truth. You know, anybody that carries himself in that way is not a strong person. Barack Obama, former president, explained that perfectly last night, that, you know, that's not a real strong man, and that's not what it's about. And you just have to look past this culture identity that they're trying to sow into our communities, that, you know, it's just hate. It's a spread of hate over and over and over again. There's no joining factors here that helps anybody.
So talk then about the ground game, because it's one thing to get a Barack Obama, one of the great orators of our time, into your community, and he can deliver. Don't worry about that. But the folks who are there on the ground, these states stay again and again, week after week, the 80-some days since Kamala Harris became the presumptive and then the nominee, in much the same place, movement a little, but within the margin of error. Tell me about the ground and what worries you about what's happening on the ground.
Democrats in my era are very, very motivated. When we switch gears from President Biden running to Kamala, there's been a real sense of energy on the ground. Everybody's motivated. There's groups all over the Northeast PA where I represent, Lackawanna, Luzerne counties, that are very, very focused, very motivated. Very focused on mail-in ballots, which is another thing where Democrats have outpaced Republicans in getting people to vote, getting out, and we're doing very well. We're doing very well. The results so far for Lackawanna County have been almost 3-1 in Democratic to Republican ballots in Lackawanna County. It's pretty much 2-1 in Luzerne County, where we're going to try and stop some of the bleeding of the Democratic votes. For the first time, Republicans have took a voter registration edge in Luzerne County this past year. So it's getting harder and harder to elect Democrats in Luzerne County. So that's something we're organizing and fighting on the ground now.
It's an interesting dichotomy, right? So Barack Obama, Lavora, comes out and, you know, he says some tough things, and then, you know, a lot of Republicans get upset about it. The same people who don't necessarily get upset at the things that Donald Trump says that arguably are a little more incendiary. For example, let me ask you about what I'm going to play now. Donald Trump in the city of Detroit, in front of business leaders in Detroit, trashing the city of Detroit. Let's play that.
The whole country is going to be like, you want to know the truth? It'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president. You're going to have a mess on your hands.
The governor, Gretchen Whitmer, says Trump will pay a price for those comments in Michigan, but will he?
I think he will. I think that the people of Detroit and, frankly, the people of Michigan are angry. You don't talk about us that way. You don't stand in our city and talk about our city that way. And he's talking about a city that's very different from the city that we know and that we love. If he spent any time in Detroit, he knows that Detroit has had a tremendous resurgence. Jobs are back in the city. Businesses are back in the city. People are moving back into the city. And the fact that he doesn't know that or doesn't care that says a lot about who he is. But this is who Donald Trump is. I mean, we've heard him over and over again say disparaging things about places where Black people live. It's just what he does. It's part of the bigotry and part of the hate, and people won't stand for it anymore. We're done.
Just 4 words. It'll be Like Detroit, Charles.
Really says to me a lot about his mental acuity at this point. There was so much conversation early on when Joe Biden was at the top of the Democratic ticket about where Donald Trump ranked as far as his age in comparison to his opponent at the time. We've heard none of that since Donald Trump has now had to deal with Kamala Harris, obviously a younger opponent. And this is an example of something that I listened to with respect to Donald Trump and his remarks about Detroit, in Detroit, following how he trashed the whole city of the RNC when they were there. And you have to wonder, is this a guy who has demonstrated a level of mental sanity and acuity at a point that he should be in charge of the country for the next 4 years, if at all? And I think that, to me, beyond the bigotry, which I see is very clear and blatant, beyond the attempts to appeal to white supremacy and his base in that way, which is almost always very prevalent when he talks, it was, for me, do you even realize where you are? And that, for me, I question it. I question it significantly in terms of making the connection of why would you go to a city and standing in the middle of that city bash that city, other than to send a message to the people outside of that city about who's there. But also, again, there are myriad ways you could do that without, lambasting the city that you're in. And so for me, it does spark questions about his mental fitness to be in that office.
I'm going to get in trouble because we're out of time. But Lavora, I have to ask you, did you speak to anybody who was actually at the Detroit? No. At the Economic Club?
No, I haven't spoken to anyone who was there. Only those of us who saw it played afterwards. And folks are fired up.